Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we connect academics and marketing. Every other week, we sit down and we look at the behavioral science that's powering some of America's best brands. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotter.
And today, we're going a little into the deep. We're talking about something that's very important, which is how can you have confidence in the behavioral science that we talk about in this podcast. Let's get into it. So, Richard, we're talking about a topic that, for us in the behavioral science community, has turned up the heat a little bit. Lots of conversations, lots of news articles in the mainstream media about academics that have had either fabricated or debunked studies. And, you know, what was once in a while in the past few years has now gotten more attention. And we wanted to make an episode to talk about this, explain our thinking on it. And we really have three goals here. One, we want to bring to light for all of our listeners some of the academics that have been refuted or that are under investigation. That's number one. We want to, talk about why this is so serious and why it's so important to get it correct. But also our opinion that it does not invalidate the whole field. And then three, we want to give the listeners, those that are listening now, the tools to have confidence in how to move forward with the behavioral science studies that most apply to them in their work. So that's our goal in this episode. Anything you want to add to that before I share a little bit about the topic?
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good. So Harvard professor Francesca Gino is in the news middle of March 2024, specifically about a lot of allegations on her work. She's known in behavioral science fields for her research into why people lie and cheat. And there's now come out 4 different papers she's published that have been called into question. So back in October of 2021, a group of statistical mathematicians on the blog Data Colada complained to Harvard University that the data math that powers her papers looks incorrect. And the Harvard then convenes a group. They do an investigation for multiple years. And to Harvard's credit, in my mind, they don't just publish the final result this past month. They also published the entire practice that they did to investigate the publications. And at least as of today, it appears that that the data in the publications are wrong. Now, she's made a claim that she did not do it intentionally or knowingly, and she is she's, I think, suing Harvard right now to get herself reinstated back at the university and for damages to her credibility. We're bringing up Gino not because we want to discuss the merits of her case, but because it brings a larger issue to life that in all scientific endeavors, there's going to be lots of really great work done, and there's going to be some work, inevitably, that is either unintentionally wrong or intentionally misleading. And so we wanted to make that a topic to open up for discussion today.
Yeah, it's that broader angle that I think's key, and that broader approach of, are the findings that are published a true insight into human nature or a fiction based on either bad actors or bad research techniques? Now, that has been a topic for a while in many scientific communities. In behavioural science and psychology, there's an academic called Brian Nosek who works at the University of Virginia, and he has undertaken something he calls the replicability project. So he recruited 270 scientists and got them to repeat 98 studies to see if the original findings could be replicated. When you look at the figure that replicates, it's less than many people would hope. Now, his initial work was just under 50%. The exact figure depends on what statistical measure you use. And some academics have critiqued his work to say, wait a minute, if you just do a one-off study to replicate the original, you might get a low figure, but other work that looks at rerunning studies multiple times comes up. Yeah. So Dan Gilbert has argued maybe the figure's more like 75%. Whatever the case is, that is a significant proportion of papers that do not bear scrutiny. So at first you think, oh my gosh, well, this behavioural science stuff, this is a massive problem, unique to that field. But actually, if you look at many other areas, psychologists, not just far beyond psychology, you see something similar. So Finelli's looked at cancer biology, Camera looked at economics. Most fields, if you try and reproduce the papers, you see similar rates of replicability. In every scientific field, there are a proportion of papers that do not reproduce when people try and rerun them.
And that is probably new news to many of the people that tune in or listen to our podcast. And part of our vision here is to disseminate important information so everybody understands it. So the first point that we're making here is replicatability of studies is a question across all scientific fields, and that's possibly a bigger issue that does not invalidate one field or validate another field. It's just a fact across all fields.
Yes, and the reason for bringing it up is sometimes stepping out of the behavioural science world and looking at a different field makes it easier to then think about what's the best next steps. Now we've found ourselves in this problematic situation. How do you use behavioural science? How do you improve? So I mentioned the studies around cancer, where there are a similar level of papers that don't reproduce. That's an interesting area to think about, because if you were thinking about a cancer treatment and for yourself, and you heard that a paper does not reproduce, that there is a bogus paper out there, I don't think the immediate reaction would be, okay, well, all of Western medicine is a joke. I'm now going to try and cure myself with a homeopathic remedy. That would be an insane reaction to some papers that are bogus. I think you take that reaction and then you should apply it to behavioural science. If you know there are papers that don't reproduce, the reaction should not be, oh, well, let's ignore this entire field. The reaction should be, let's make sure we are very clear about the papers that have been replicated multiple times and are genuine findings, and the papers that haven't replicated. And we should just be focusing our energies and our learning on that rigorous proportion of the papers.
And is there a way for folks who are interested in this to find where studies either have high levels of replication or where they have been invalidated?
Yeah, there's probably two things you can do. There are some psychologists whose work has been retracted by people like Brian Wansink, who was at Cornell, and there are now databases to show which paper has been invalidated, which papers haven't.
Which we can put in the show notes.
Yeah. So there are some really positive areas for people to use, and also keep on top of behavioural science or work with genuine experts who know which papers have been debunked. But the second bit is, and this is a general point with science doesn't prove things. It is a continually evolving body of work. It hasn't reached absolute truth. It's what we think is true to the best of our knowledge. In 50 years' time, things that we believe are true now will have been disproven.
Hopefully.
Of course. Yeah, otherwise we're not improving. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's the basis of proving. So you should then think, well, okay, that means there are some findings out there that haven't been actively debunked, but might well be proven to be wrong in the future. Now, obviously, you can't predict what those are completely, but let's think about a few different findings from behavioural science. Okay, there's a finding of social proof. That's the idea that if something is popular, if it's seen to be popular, it'll become more appealing and people are more likely to pick it. That's one finding from behavioural science. Another finding is the order effect of anchoring, which is if you have three prices, low, medium, high, the way you want to display them is the most expensive first,
High, medium,
low. That will generate the largest average sales value. That's from Suckley and Lichtenstein, a 2012 study. Now, social proof has been experimented on in various forms, conformity kind of type experiments back to the 1930s in the work of people like Sharif. There are hundreds of experiments in that area. That broad finding that in most circumstances for most people, stressing a product is popular will increase its sales or its appeal. That is as robust as you're going to get. The order of effective anchoring is a single paper done by 3 academics 12 years ago. Now, I've no evidence that that's not going to replicate, but it's only been shown once. The level of confidence we have in that finding should be very different from the level of confidence we have in social proof. And that nuance is important for people. The question should be, is this study a one-off, or has it been shown on multiple occasions? And of course, our confidence in the finding should vary accordingly.
Right. We're talking about giving a healthy dose of evaluation to the studies so that you have more confidence in the studies that have more evidence that they're replicatable, and the ones that don't should be treated as such, that they're a good idea that's been tested and proven once, twice, 3 times, but not hundreds.
Yeah. Again, thinking about a different field, if we were to talk about literature and the merits of fiction, we wouldn't treat every book the same. We'd say we'd be accept that Shakespeare or Twain should be rated more highly than a book that you only ever see in a pharmacist.
Yes.
Of course, there's variance in exactly the same way that there is variance in the merit of fiction. There's variation in the merits of behavioural science studies, and you can have greater confidence in the studies that are being run multiple times.
And I'm going to push on this point because we're not really being defensive of behavioral science. What we're trying to do is widen the aperture when there's questions about the confidence in a study, how we should approach it. Behavioral science is unique in that it's the observed outcomes based on certain stimulus. So it's a little bit different than the laws of gravity, in that these are not physical sciences. This is social sciences and observed behavior. How do you think of that?
So that's a very good point. When you start dealing with people, they have free will
Inherently.
and we're talking about propensities and probabilities.
That's right.
Not laws. And that brings in another area, which is the importance of context. So social proof, rigorously proven experiment in lots of different areas. There are still certain contexts where it has either been shown not to work or it's actually backfired. So there's a famous study by the Behavioural Insights team in the UK and HMRC, which is His Majesty's Revenue and Collections. They're the people that collect taxes.
Yeah.
2011, they send out 140,000 letters. The control message says, pay your tax on time and you'll get a massive fine. And from memory, 68% of people pay their tax on time. Next set of letters say the same threat, but they add on 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. And it goes up to 73, 74% of people paying tax on time.
In that instance, social proof increased the compliance with paying taxes.
Exactly. As you would expect, that's what the evidence suggests. There's another little nuance, which is if you say 9 out of 10 people in Birmingham or Glasgow pay their tax on time, to those audiences, those citizens in those cities, you go up to 82% of people paying their tax on time. But what's relevant for us is it was such a large data set that the academics or the practitioners behind the study could look at lots of different individual audiences. And what they found was that for the top 5% of debtors, these are normally super rich people who just haven't paid their tax, the top 5% of debtors became less likely to pay if they were told what 9 out of 10 people did. They genuinely believed they were a unique audience, a super successful audience who weren't like other people. And because they believed that to their core, when they heard what other people were doing, they became less likely to pay.
The opposite.
Yes, yeah. So the fact that they became less likely to pay doesn't invalidate the principle of social proof. Of the 135,000 letters they sent out, social proof increased probability to pay. It was this small subset where it works in the opposite direction. The sensible reaction to finding that out isn't to reject social proof in its entirety. It's to think, well, let's use social proof against that 95%.
Obviously.
And amongst the 5%, well,
Right.
What is the message that best works against them? And I think from the testing the HMRC did, they found that the best way to get those people to pay was to tell them the loss to the exchequer if they didn't contribute. So, you owe £200,000. If you don't pay it, we can't afford to pay 6 teaching assistants. Making that loss tangible, that their concrete loss to society, that's what most effectively encourage payment. So even with a very well proven bias, it doesn't mean that it works in every single setting. And as a social science, I don't think you should ever expect it to. People are complicated. Context is important. Just because something works in most settings doesn't mean it works in every setting.
And what we can take away from this is that we're always in a constant test and learn environment. So as we find that learning, like the tax collection in the United Kingdom, we cohort, we do a different message, and we keep evolving. But getting back to the issue of invalidated tests. So you talked about what happens if it doesn't work the way you planned. That's a little different than a fabricated study or a study that's intentionally wrong. How do we understand, or what do we do when we come across those types of studies?
I've heard it sometimes referred to as invalidated studies, either faked studies or there was an error in the methodology. They can often be disproved, yet people keep on quoting them. I've heard them described as zombie studies. I think there is a real need for people who work in the field of behavioural science to be very careful about the studies that they quote. And if something has been disproven, we've got to go to real efforts to expunge it from the database, stop talking about it. Unfortunately, it's often not the behavioural scientists who keep on repeating debunked studies. It's the popular press, because sometimes those debunked studies came up with a really wacky, counterintuitive, exciting finding, and that excitement and bizarreness powers it to be repeated again and again, rather than maybe the duller truth, which people are less keen to repeat.
So, Richard, we really wanted to make sure in this episode we gave people confidence that as they're using behavioral science principles and relying on these biases, that they can know that it's going to return value for them and their brands. We were talking before the episode started about one way you can have a lot of confidence, which is testing yourself. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Of course. The brilliant thing with these behavioural science studies is the methodologies in the public domain. You can subscribe to a journal, you can download the methodology. What I would suggest is if you read a study which you think has relevance to your brand, rather than changing your entire comms to reflect it, why not have a middle ground? Take a small percentage of your web traffic, a small percentage of your digital advertising, or direct mail, and test the principle in the real world. So let's say you've read a study about temporal reframing, the idea that was first shown by Gorville, that if you talk about prices as £1 a day, they feel much cheaper than if you talk about them as £365 a year. If you've read that, and you found out that Gorville's study was done on charities, if you are running a shop that sells ice cream, or a insurance broker, you might think, well, I'm not 100% sure if that fact that Gorville found is either genuine or even if it's genuine, whether it'll work in my context.
Does it apply for me?
So for 5% of the traffic to your insurance site, don't say that you cost £10 a month, say you cost 30 pence a day. Yeah. I'm glad you did the math there. Exactly. And then that's the best proof you're ever going to have. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to cost you much. Really simple, small scale, real world experiment in which you prioritize what people do rather than what they say. That's the best way of having faith in these studies.
And I think we often spend our time on the podcast talking about the campaigns, the brand insights, the product development that is based on behavioral science or leverages behavioral science. That's big and grand in nature. But the reality is, these big, grand insights can be tested on a small scale and can be iterated on until you have the confidence that it should go and lead your next communications campaign, or that it should be iterated on before you make that next product design change. So really using behavioral science on the ground floor with actual buyers, with actual people, and seeing how it changes the results is a really great place to start, regardless if you have questions about the integrity or the applicability of the study. So let's come to a close and let's recap for everyone listening the big takeaways of today's episode.
So we've covered 3 broad areas. We've started by talking about the applicability project by Brian Nosek, where he shows that there are a proportion of behavioural science studies that if you try and rerun the study, you don't get the same result. Now, the most important thing, which is our kind of second big point, is when you find this out, don't respond by rejecting the entire field of behavioural science, because some studies don't replicate, doesn't mean that it invalidates all those other studies that do replicate. And then the third and final thing we talked about was, what do you do differently now you know this? And I think the key bits there are focus on studies that have been shown to work again and again and again. Secondly, check if you ever come across a finding that sounds too good to be true or doesn't pass the sniff test. Check to see it hasn't been debunked at a later date. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, whenever you find a study and you are thinking about whether it's correct for your brand, the best test is to run a simple, observed experiment. Some of your audience see a version that harnesses that bias, some see the control version. And that's the acid test. That's the best possible test that you can run.
And obviously, we're engaged all the time by clients all over the globe to help with behavioral science, but we created the Consumer Behavior Lab to spread broad knowledge. If you really are not sure, just drop us a line. We're happy to make sure if we know it off the top of our heads, or we'll point you in the right direction. For us, we're trying to raise the use of behavioral science across America and across the globe so that advertising becomes more effective. And this whole podcast today is dedicated to understanding some of the more of the nuances of the scientific integrity, but also making sure that everyone listening has a real course to go forward on and feel confident in that. We talked about a topic that could be a little testy. We discussed the angles of it and went a little deep on it. We invite the audience to let us know how they're thinking about these topics. By the time this episode goes live, there may be a lot of new information out in the world about either Professor Gino or others, and we'll keep the conversation going from there. Until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.